It's a critical time for land conservation as development pushes more residents into the state's remaining wild lands. But there are programs to help preserve those properties for future generations. I'm joined now by several people focused on Florida's environmental future. Alison Dor, president of the North Florida Land Trust. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Heather Barnes, community outreach coordinator for the Ocala to Osceola Wildlife Corridor. Hey, Heather.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. And Florida Times Union columnist Mark Woods, author of Lassoing the Sun, A Year in America's National Parks. Hi, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. And what questions or concerns do you have about land conservation in Florida? Call us at 549-2937, email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or contact us via X, Instagram, or Facebook. Alison Dor, I want to get to the work of the Land Trust in just a moment, but first I want to talk just a little bit about your incredible career because it's really quite something. So you're currently a priest with the Episcopal Diocese of Florida. You have degrees in criminology, theology, and law. You worked as a prosecutor, public defender, judge, and sheriff down in the Everglades.
In Key West, if you can imagine.
You also ran for lieutenant governor. This is like almost a Forrest Gump kind of resume that you have. I just am astonished at that list of many and varied accomplishments.
Well, I think each and every one of them was a call of some kind, and this is a call now. And it sounds a little odd to have an Episcopal priest as president of the local land trust, but the first president of the Florida Audubon was the Bishop of Minnesota. So there's ample precedent, and protecting God's creation is stewardship, and that's a call.
Yeah. So the North Florida Land Trust is doing its work to preserve land at a very critical time. The state's population is now moving towards 26 million people. We're already facing serious acreage loss due to sea level rise. And University of Florida study estimates that an additional 1 million undeveloped acres will be paved over in the next 2 decades. How is the North Florida Land Trust trying to respond to some of those challenges?
Well, our motto right now is that it's now or never, and that's why I was willing to, after spending a lot of years in prison ministry and then a little bit in the church bureaucracy, I was willing to go back into conservation. I had been the Everglades czar under Governor Bush, and we had put together the largest environmental restoration ever. And then Governor Graham and he is the Democrat, I as the Republican, back in a time when I guess people could reach across the aisle more easily than today, we did something called Amendment 1 and co-chaired it, which was the largest commitment of funds ever, anywhere, to my knowledge, to conservation. And it's going to be about $1 billion with a B dollars in Florida this year for conservation. And then we've been able to use the political skills that I do have remaining and went over and had a very good conversation with Speaker Ritter, who was heroic. And he literally said, how much do you need for O, which is the corridor from Ocala National Forest to Osceola? And I said, Mr. Speaker, we need $400 million. And I'll be darned if he didn't put it in the budget. So he has done heroic. And we have been able to secure some federal funding in the tune of tens of millions. We're going to have to match some of that,
Sure.
About $10 million probably, but
Heather,
we're off to the races.
He mentioned the O corridor. That's something that you help oversee, the Ocala to Osceola Wildlife Corridor. Explain what that is.
Yeah, so essentially it's a landscape that connects, a passageway essentially for wildlife and plants, and also for those like working farmers and foresters who kind of live off the land. They use this corridor every day. It's a way of life. So essentially, there is a need to, as with the growing population that you mentioned, there is definitely a need to protect from Ocala National Forest all the way up to Osceola. So it is now or never. It is kind of at that tipping point. So that's where back in 2017, partners around that time, I think even before then, they were probably even working in the landscape already. but different organizations from nonprofits to state to federal partners and other private landowners, even organizations came together and created a about 26 led partner group called the O2O Partnership, and that's where we have kind of ventured to today. And NRCS is involved as well, and that's kind of where the RCPP, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, came into play, and that's what was posted about a week or so.
Okay, yeah, I just got to kind of talk right straight in the mic so you
Okay.
don't fall off. Mark, you've done a lot of
Thanks.
writing about the environment over your years, and obviously your amazing book. For people who haven't read Lassoing the Sun, it's not just a tour of America's national parks and a tribute to them, but it really is just a beautiful elegy for your mother, who died while you were writing that book. And it's extraordinary. So I'm a huge fan of your writing. But what does it mean to try to communicate the value of the environment to your readers?
Yeah, I guess it's something I've come back to again and again, obviously with the book, but, with what I write about for the Times Union. And, there's a lot to write about in our area. I was, as when you sent me the text about talking about conservation, I kind of sat down. I was thinking 1999 was the Preservation Project. So we're the 25th anniversary of that. And that's really such a huge, huge piece of Jacksonville where we are today. Thank goodness we did that. Mayor Delaney and, Mark Middlebrook as his right-hand man. And, it's just a great success story in conservation in a state that has kind of a mixed record on that. Allison's right. We have done a lot in Florida. There's a lot of success stories, but there's obviously a lot of failures. Our coastline, the way we've developed it is one of the failures. But the Preservation Project is an amazing. The land. That's part of the reason I moved here in 2001 was because of the amount of land that is preserved here in the parks and all those things. Now we have a lot of work to do. Since then, we've been talking about we need to have not just the biggest, but the best parks. And, that's been a mantra for as long as I've been here. So that's something that goes beyond the preservation.
And you've done walks across the city famously. You've also done a lot of running, and you explore parks and the public space more than most people I know. One of those properties is in the Pumpkin Hill area. I think it's being called now the Seven Creeks area that the North Florida Land Trust has been pretty instrumental in helping to assemble. For people who haven't been out there, describe a little bit what it's like.
Yeah, that's a great example of the preservation project of North Florida Land Trust. Of I think it's 5,600 acres. The name, as it implies, is Seven Creeks. It's been there for a while. It was kind of rebranded a couple of years ago. Timaquan Parks Foundation was very involved to let people know. And up on the north side, and it's there. There's a spot there. Betts Tiger Point. When you stand there and you have basically a panoramic view with no development of this marsh. I mean, it's one of the prettiest views you'll find in Jacksonville in Florida, and that's because of preservation efforts. And I think it has more infrastructure up there now. I think there's 30 miles of trails. It's one of those places. Yeah, we kind of need to get people out to it and experience it, because once you've been up there, you're like, this is amazing, and this is in the city of Jacksonville.
I think it's worth noting, Allison, that the Preservation Project's roots, as former Mayor John Delaney often acknowledged, came from like a boat trip that he took where he saw for the first time really the majesty of some of those areas, the kind of marsh and estuary areas.
That's part of how we sold Governor Bush on what became Florida Forever and the Teddy Roosevelt Society to Tom Slade. There's no substitute for getting somebody into a vote.
Tom Slade was a former chair
Party,
of the
party chairman.
Republican Party, and maybe wouldn't have been a natural first choice, you'd think, for an environmental ally.
I think that's fair. He was, when we got him out in the boat in Florida Bay, I said, Tom, I know you just soon pay me to look at it, but the truth is no referendum in Florida has ever gotten less than 72% of the vote on the environment. And I can see the wheels turning, and that led to a whole cascade of things. And what we've been able to do, there's a tendency in American political life to be antipodal and think of it as either or. And I'm right, you're wrong, red, blue, whatever. And that's just not been the tradition in Florida. We've been able to make, from Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, through Bob Graham, the Democrat, and Childs, the Democrat, Governor Martinez, my old running mate, with Preservation 2000, Jeb with Florida Forever. It's become a bipartisan issue. And it's not even a development versus protection. The investment, I use Central Park as an exaggerated example, but that was a controversial decision to put 800 acres in the middle of Manhattan into conservation 150 years ago. But it has produced the highest land values in the world on its periphery. So smart developers like Farmington down in Bunnell or Babcock Ranch down further south have blended conservation as an element into their development plans and actually leverage the value of what they do develop. So there's a win-win scenario, and that's this program we're announcing now, RCPP, is a way for people who've been on the land for a long time, and they're very good stewards of it and know it intimately and frankly are better stewards than the government ever would be, allows them to sell their development rights and keep the land, and allows access for the public, but not in ways that impinge things like calving season and timber harvesting. So there's a balancing of the public and private interests in ways that, if it's done right, everybody wins.
And so you're talking about conservation easements. If our listeners have questions about conservation easements or how to participate in the program, you can certainly give us a call. We're at 549-2937, or you can send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Or if you just have questions or comments about Florida's environmental future. Heather, talk about the how the conservation easement program works specifically. How do people participate, and what benefits do they receive if they do set aside land as a conservation easement?
Yes, excuse me, definitely. So essentially what will happen is it would work as with any, sort of transaction. You would reach out to either us at NFLT, or you would reach out to NRCS. The information is on the news release as well, as far as contact info. But yes, you would just reach out, and we encourage any questions, because as with any government program, there are, some, innuendos, and maybe some things need to be explained in a different way. So that's what our job is here to do, is to help the farmers and foresters kind of get down to, what they're looking for, what they need. And then from that point forward, we work with them, get them set up through the Farm Service Agency. That's associated with NRCS. So there's a lot of paperwork involved with that. But the sooner the better.
So let's explain the acronyms. NRCS.
NRCS, yes, that is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Yes, so that is through the USDA. So that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, essentially.
And it's not just aimed at conservation for the sake of conservation. One of the initiatives that we do a lot of in this region is Air Force and Navy buffer zones. When people move in proximity of a military facility, sometimes the transplants decide it's noisy, and they seem to be somewhat surprised, which is odd to me. It sounds like freedom, but in any event, the military have wisely decided to protect their bases periphery by assisting in acquisition of buffer land. So, for instance, around Camp Blanding, which is a huge economic and security driver for this region, we bought thousands of acres around it, protecting that land from being developed in ways that would impinge the military's ability to use that land for defense purposes. So there's a lot of interplay here that's very sophisticated work, and we've been doing this now 25 years, and we're pretty good at it.
There is, Mark, growing pressure, as we kind of mentioned earlier, on some of these lands, and some of them really not seemingly that, forward-looking, particularly in the Timucuan area. You see a lot of new development in areas that are likely or kind of mapped out in the city's own resiliency projections to be, inaccessible underwater, or really getting a lot of flood damage. What's the interplay between the work of conservation and resiliency and, obvious strong development pressures?
Yeah, obviously is and should be a huge topic in Florida. I've lived all over the state. When I first moved here, I lived in Brevard County, lived in Orlando, lived in Tampa, lived in South Florida. And a lot of those places did not do a good job of preservation land. That they have little pockets left. We kind of have that luxury that we've done pretty well at this, but if we're not careful, we can go the path of some of those areas. That's why it's very important what Allison and Heather are doing. What would you say? Now or never?
Now or never.
Yeah. It feels like we've done better than a lot of the state, but there's no guarantees. That was kind of one of the things, looking at the national parks, going back to that I thought about often. Like if that hadn't been done when it was done, those places would be gone. I mean, we just take for granted that Yellowstone's there, that Yosemite is there, but that isn't a given. Not only then, but it's kind of a perpetual thing. You have to keep protecting these places and explaining and getting people out in them and why this is important, even if you don't go to them, why it's important. And some of it is the resiliency and the, if you build in the wrong spots, it's going to cost all of us. So.
But the thing we do that's a little different is we don't agitate, we don't get involved in zonings, we buy land. Or the interested land, the development interest. So we're very respectful of property rights. I come from a citrus and cattle family that's been here since Florida was Spanish. So I'm not what you would normally consider to be a tree hugger. But I'm an old-fashioned Teddy Roosevelt Republican conservationist. There aren't a lot of us left, but there are a few.
But it's pragmatic. I mean, as Mark
yeah.
was saying, it's a financial resource for places. Obviously Central Park is a great example, but anybody that is living adjacent to an undeveloped natural parcel is, going to enjoy better property values.
Well, that's the irony. We actually did some studies when I was working in the governor's office, and even in the most rural of counties, the highest land values that we could find in those counties were around the state parks. So it really is a properly done, it increases the value of the community in both property and lifestyle.
Heather, is there a limit on the size of properties that are eligible? I was recently discussing with my mom, because she's a big birder, about a property that was in St. Johns County that was a really like a fruitful rookery that they were trying to save. I think it was like adjacent to an old golf course.
Okay.
But it's private property and it's not very large.
Right.
What are the parameters when something is or is not eligible for something like a conservation easement?
I mean, typically, so, for a conservation easement, just because typically the value is usually 50 to 60%, I mean, it could vary, of, your just value of a property. So sometimes the actual work of doing the transaction could end up, being a little bit more, so we always try to aim towards those that are larger, the larger acreages, but there are also opportunities for the smaller acreages. We have several partners that we work with as well that also help with those smaller acreages. But it's up to the funding organization that's involved and kind of the path that the owner wants to take as well.
And we're actually looking at that particular piece you're speaking of, and it is a stunning rookery. And we've been working with the developer who's been very gracious. That one is outside of the government channels for money, so we're having difficulty raising the funds for that. So really from our end, what we need more of is we have converted to being a member organization, and I did this in the Keys with the land trust down there, and we went from 100 to 5,000 within 3 years. So I'm confident we can have several thousand members here, which will give us more of a grassroots and then we're going to need some serious match money in the next few years. We've got a lot of money out of the state and federal government, but some of it requires matches. And then, most of all, we need the landowners to step up to the plate and consider conservation as an alternative.
If I can add to that, really encouraging, just going back to the smaller acreage, if anyone has questions, like just reach out, because value really is different for everyone. So as long as we, if we can get out there and see what is on the ground, and that's going to be key for sure.
We'll look at anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's now or never.
Are there some tax breaks for property owners if they put aside land in a conservation easement? Do they eventually have to relinquish the land to a conservation purpose, or does it remain with them as owners?
It depends on it really depends on what the landowner wants. We can structure it any way they want, from a charitable contribution to cash. Not all of the value of it, but 50 to 60% we can get out just for the development rights. That's the farmer's dilemma. Many of these people love the land, and they don't want to see it develop, but they also don't want to be unfair to their family. And so downstream, and frankly, one of the barriers to entrance as a farmer, if you're a young farmer, is land cost. So if we strip if they sell us the development rights, and they can say keep the land in timber or hunting or a family weekend compound, or we've also been able to, we do selling of green carbon credits. We've developed tortoise habitat and increased tortoise capacity, for which we get paid, and then turn around and put that money back into buying land. So we're highly innovative, and as you can tell from my resume, I'm slightly entrepreneurial. So I'm just putting it into green purposes.
Mark, are there any particular properties that or areas of the region that you're particularly concerned about, or that you think people need to understand the environmental value of?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, we were talking about that Black Hammock area when you talked about Seven Creeks. That's been, there was a battle up there for development, that there will be a development going in, that was kind of fought by the people up there and lost. That area is growing tremendously, so I think we have to be careful up there to preserve that.
That's something you can really see when you're kind of flying over,
Yeah.
because you see these vast wild marshes, and then, just kind of tic-tac home developments all over, kind of encroaching on that.
Right. And this is a little different than that. I was thinking about how we get preservation land, and some of it is, federal funding. Land and Water Conservation Fund is huge funding, but some of it has been generosity throughout the history of individuals. The Acadia National Park we have because of the Rockefellers, Grand Tetons because of the Rockefellers. But then sometimes, one of the stories I love locally is Willie Brown and the Theodore Roosevelt area. This is not a wealthy person. He had moved onto this land when he was 6 months old, and then was still there in 1970. Before he died, he said, I want to give this land to the people with basically one stipulation, and that was do nothing with it. And, that's one of my favorite spots, partly because it's just a beautiful part of our city. It has a little bit of rolling to it, and the round marsh. But I love that story that Willie Brown said, this land is your land, and he wanted it named after Theodore Roosevelt because that was his kind of
Amen.
hero. So that kind of ties into what, Allison and Heather are trying to do. And some of you're you're getting money and land from a lot of different places. And if you look at the places that we take for granted locally and in America, it's interesting to see kind of their origin story and think about it.
There's another great story along those lines with possibly a smaller parcel, but Susie Spencer, who people might remember was an environmentalist activist in Jacksonville for a long time, believe she finally was able to donate. Is it Bogey Creek?
Hmm.
That park, which is a beautiful park I hadn't been to until just a couple of years ago. But that was her family's land.
It is, and the Cummers have been very supportive of us, and the Skinners, and so a lot of the older families that have made for generations money out of extraction of natural resources have been very strong about stepping up to the plate. And when I talk to people about this and stress that it's now or never, I can see in the old cracker eyes that they get it. They understand this is the end game. And the transplants actually, call it what you will, maybe it's I got mineism, but once they get here, they decide it's quite enough Yankees in town and maybe it's time to choke this thing off. But you got to be respectful to the landowner too. And that's the path that we've chosen. We don't, when they're tired of the rezonings or the insurance company won't actually insure, if they want to talk to about an exit strategy with us, we'll talk.
It's very interesting that you kind of occupy that space because, their development interests aren't going anywhere. Your board has a number of developers on it, well-known folks.
We do.
And I think you must believe that their buy-in and support is every bit as essential as the environmental community.
We don't have any trouble convincing the environmental community. I had somebody complain about a recent board selection from the green side, and I said, well, I'm reminded of the words of Willie Sutton when they said, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. So I'm happy to have development interests on our board because that's where the land is.
Yeah, right. And so North Florida Land Trust is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. What is, if anything, is planned? I know you're trying to build your membership. How are you going about doing that?
Well, first off, since you mentioned Bogey Creek, Seven Creeks Festival, I think it was held last year and possibly the year before. I don't know if it was around COVID times, but thank you. But yes, that will be happening again coming up in March. And then as far as events, we probably within the last year or so in February, we partnered with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So actually the ODO is a kind of a critical linkage within the larger statewide Florida Wildlife Corridor. So we partnered with them to get a film released, and it's going to incorporate veterans going on an expedition, 3-day hike throughout the Ocala forest, going all the way up into the Osceola and making stops along the way to meet with some of these landowners and critical players that are involved in helping to save the land. So there's going to be opportunities in the future for that film to be seen for the public.
And then our annual meeting will be March 3rd, I think. It's coming up in March, and that'll be our 25th anniversary, and we've got some really heroic people who have, over the last 20 years, helped us to grow to where we are, and we're going to honor them.
We got an email here from a name that people in the environmental community will recognize, Jim Sutton. He says, my name's Jim Sutton, a resident of Ocean Way. He said, I've spent the better part of the last 20 years exploring the area now known as Seven Creeks. The work of the Land Trust and its associated agencies provides benefits that are so important on so many levels. At the very least, some of the vistas that you described a few moments ago, I find equally beautiful and are rivaled only by a trip to the Everglades. I encourage everyone to explore these local areas and support the people and groups that are preserving these beautiful natural havens for all of us. Mark, obviously that's, kind of the trajectory of your own environmental reporting is trying to convey that beauty and then have people explore.
Yeah, I mean, if people ask me, because I post paddleboard pictures on social media, where should I go? And some of them are downtown. I say don't start there because the currents can be a little tricky. But Pumpkin Hill up there, the creek up there is is an amazing spot. You have to kind of pay attention to the tides, but you get out there and you look around and it's just stunning. I remember Ron Littlepage wrote a lot about the environment also, and that was, I think he used to say that was he'd talk about how that was his favorite spot to paddle. So that up there in Cedar Point, just a little south of there, which is a National Park Service site. That's another thing we didn't really touch upon up there. Seven Creeks is what kind of makes it special is it's people ask, is that a national park, a state park, and a city park? And I go, yes, yes. It's all. It's kind of it's a great cooperative effort among these three to preserve the land and then also the management. And it's in all three instances, I think it's a good example of what city parks can do. Each of the pieces are really nicely done. So I highly recommend, go out there to Seven Creeks Festival, or go on another weekend. But if you haven't been up there, that's a good kind of place to start, because they have things going on where we'll have guided hikes and things like that with the ranger, or we'll have kayaks available, those kind of things. So I don't know what the date is, but look for that, and that is a great way to experience that part of our area.
And we have only begun to touch the potential of ecotourism in this region. If you look at ecotourism in South Florida, for instance, Everglades National Park gets a couple of million visitors a year. Biscayne gets about 500,000, and the Keys get several million. And the economic impact on those communities is substantial.
Right.
Well, it's so nice to have this conversation with you. We appreciate the work of the North Florida Land Trust. Alison DeFoor, Heather Barnes, Mark Woods of the Florida Times-Union, thank you so much for being here.
It was an honor.
Thank you.
Thank
We can't
you,
do
Ann.
this without you guys.
And